Next, a debate in New Mexico's three-way race for U.S. Senate with Democratic incumbent Martin Heinrich, Republican Mick Rich, and former New Mexico Governor Gary Johnson, who's running as a Libertarian. This is an hour.
Good evening, I'm Doug Fernandez. Welcome to our Commitment 2018 coverage and the KOAT Albuquerque Journal U.S. Senate debate. The candidates tonight, Democrat Senator Martin Heinrich, Republican Mick Rich, and Libertarian Gary Johnson. On our panel, asking the questions tonight is my co-anchor here on Action 7 News, Shelley Rabando, and Albuquerque Journal Senior Editor Kent Waltz. We'd also like to thank the League of Women Voters for keeping track of the timing for us in tonight's debate. Now, before we get started, let's take a quick look at the rules for tonight's debate. Candidates will each get 90 seconds for an opening statement in an order we drew a short time ago. Then we will take a few questions from Shelley and Kent. Each candidate will then have 1 minute and 15 seconds to respond and a 30-second rebuttal opportunity. Twice during the debate, each candidate will be able to ask their own question of one of their opponents. Then at the end of the night, they will all get 1 minute for a closing statement. Now, per the drawing, Gary Johnson will go first with your opening statement.
I'm Gary Johnson. I'm running for the U.S. Senate. I grew up in New Mexico. I started a one-man handyman business in Albuquerque, grew it to over 1,000 employees. I got elected governor of New Mexico. I think the takeaway from my having been governor is the promise that I made when I was running. I promised to put the issues that should be on the front burner, regardless of the political consequences. So I was not a wallflower as governor. And I think what people saw was honesty. I think what they saw was transparency, and I think they saw respect. I think the biggest issue facing this country right now is the deficit, is the fact that we're going to have $1 trillion this year in added deficit to the $21 trillion that we already have. My pledge is to submit a balanced budget to Congress. It's incredibly unfair to young people. It's incredibly unfair to all of us to continue to roll up unpaid debt. $210 billion a year is what we add for interest-only expense when interest rates go up 1%. Look, to balance the federal budget, you got to take on some really big issues. Those big issues are reform of Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security has to be reformed, and we have to reduce military expenditures. Let's get ourselves out of our military involvements that don't involve national security.
Time, Mr.
I
Johnson.
promise I will uphold the United States Constitution.
Mr. Heinrich, you're next with your opening remarks.
Growing up, my mom was a factory worker, and my dad was a lineman for the local utility company. They remain the hardest working people that I've ever known. And despite the fact that my dad never finished college and my mom never got her high school diploma, they were able to build a brighter future for our entire family. All they ever really wanted was for their kids to have more opportunities than they had. For my sisters and I to be able to go to college if we wanted to. They wanted to own their own home, even if that meant decades of paying into a mortgage. And they wanted to know that the money that was taken out of their paychecks every 2 weeks for their entire working lives would actually be there for them when they retired. They worked really hard, but it's just as true to say that the American economy worked hard for them. And for too many New Mexicans, for too many people all across this country, that's what's changed. I'm running for re-election to the United States Senate because I think New Mexicans deserve an economy that works for all of us, not just a few.
Thank you, Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Rich, your opening statement.
Thank you. It's great to be here this evening. My name is Mick Rich, and I care about New Mexico. That's why I'm running for the United States Senate. I came to New Mexico almost 40 years ago for a good paying job. As I traveled the state, I fell in love with the people who call New Mexico home, their commitment to family and community. That's why I chose to raise my family here and start my construction company here. For 35 years, I've been building the communities in New Mexico while providing good paying jobs. As an advocate for vocational training and education, I helped start one of the first vocational education programs in the state. as well as several apprenticeship programs. I am a Catholic Christian, and I believe in the sanctity of life. Today, our state is struggling. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation. Our crime is out of control, and we have one of the lowest graduation rates for high school of any state in the union. And Senator Heinrich, he's focused on more wilderness. He has become a Washington politician. He has abandoned New Mexico. I will focus on good-paying jobs, safe communities, and schools that work for our state. So, I support the president's policies that have been good for our state, but I am running to be your U.S. Senator, and I will be your advocate in Washington. Thank you.
Okay, our first question from tonight's debate comes from Action 7 News anchor Shelley Rabando. Shelley.
Good evening to all of you. We've just watched a contentious process that resulted in the narrow confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Some Democrats are calling for more investigation and the possible impeachment of Kavanaugh. What's your position of the possibility of an impeachment proceeding, and what philosophy would guide you in voting on future nominees to the Supreme Court by President Trump?
Mr. Johnson, you have a minute 15.
Well, if there were future evidence presented that would in fact warrant impeachment, I would vote to impeach if that in fact existed. What's at stake here in my running for the U.S. Senate is potentially being the swing vote in the U.S. Senate. Based on Kavanaugh's position that he is a constitutional judge, was a constitutional judge, I would have voted yes for Kavanaugh. I do believe there's innocence until proven guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Heinrich, you are next.
Well, I think what we're really talking about here, and why we're talking so much about the Kavanaugh nomination, is the wrestling that we are going through with regard to sexual misconduct in this country. And I think that's at the heart of this issue. And I voted against Judge Kavanaugh in part because of his judicial rulings in the past. He is someone who believes and has ruled that corporations are people and money is speech. And I think that is really at the heart of what is eating away at our political process today. But I also believe that it's important to take survivors at their word, to believe survivors and to listen to their stories. And when I saw the president mocking a survivor that had the guts to come forward, I was really just deeply disappointed in where our politics have taken us. I think we can do better than that. I think we can have better Supreme Court justices who get 60 votes.
Mr. Rich, you are next. Your response?
I support President Trump's judicial nominees, and I would have voted for the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh. He's a strict constitutionalist, and he will interpret the law in accordance with the Constitution. That's why I support, and I would have voted for Judge Kavanaugh.
Okay, a rebuttal opportunity for each one of you now. Mr. Johnson, you go first.
It was frustrating to me.
I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
No, and I was frustrated to see the rancor that happened in Washington, the personal attacks on Judge Kavanaugh and his family. That is what's wrong with Washington right now. We need senators that are going to come together and dialogue from one side to the other. My Democratic opponent, he was against Judge Kavanaugh as soon as his name was chosen, before he even had an opportunity to sit down and talk to him or even review his record. That's putting politics before our state and our country. I'm running to be New Mexico's U.S. Senator, and I care about our state and our country. And I would look at all the evidence before me before I'm willing to make that decision. Thank you.
Rebuttal opportunity now. Mr. Johnson, you have 30 seconds.
Well, when I was governor of New Mexico, I actually reversed myself on the death penalty, recognizing that there are actually mistakes made when it comes to the death penalty, that we actually put innocent people to death. So in this country, first and foremost, there is a presumption of innocence. I don't want to say that Dr. Ford was even untruthful. It's just that there was not evidence enough for me to consider not voting for Judge Kavanaugh.
Mr. Heinrich, you have 30 seconds as well.
All I called for was to get to the bottom of it, to have a real FBI investigation. And unfortunately, what we had instead was a bit of a show for about 5 days. My opponent, Mr. Rich, made a comment that I should go to a high school and tell kids that if they do something inappropriate, they shouldn't have a future. Sexual misconduct, sexual assault is not just inappropriate, it's a crime.
Mr. Rich, 30 seconds as well.
I support our young people. As a U.S. Senator, I am running for all New Mexicans. Going to hear all the evidence before me and judge that evidence. Judge Kavanaugh got a fair hearing. Dr. Ford got a fair hearing. We've seen the evidence. It's time to move on. Thank you.
Okay, our next question in our debate comes from Albuquerque Journal senior editor Kent Waltz. Kent.
Thank you, Doug, and good evening. What can the Senate do to improve, control, or even lower health care costs in New Mexico and the rest of the country?
This time, Mr. Heinrich, you go first.
Well, the first thing we can do to improve the cost of health care is to stop inserting so much uncertainty into the system. You know, we just saw ACA rates go down this year by a small amount, but they went up for 2 years because of the uncertainty in the system. And private sector health insurance rates have gone sky high in the last few years. We need to stabilize this system. There's been bipartisan legislation to do that. People like Patty Murray and Lamar Alexander, both of which I've worked extensively with, have said we can pass something, we can put reinsurance in place and other things that will lower costs and create stability in the system again. But this president was hell-bent on destabilizing the system, on undermining the protections we have for pre-existing conditions, on repealing without replace the Affordable Care Act. That would have been devastating for New Mexico. The Affordable Care Act brought billions of dollars into this state, grew thousands of jobs in this state, and lowered our uninsured rate. We should build on that to bring costs down.
Mr. Rich, you're next with your response.
I care about New Mexico. Insurance, health insurance is a big deal. It is for my family. The Affordable Care Act was anything but affordable and accessible. I am for affordable, accessible health care. That means that allowing individuals to purchase health plans that work for them, not Washington. Allow them to purchase health plans across state lines. Lastly, it's frustrating to me to see what's going on. I was told, and my daughter and I were in the audience when Senator Heinrich was a congressman, and he told us, if you like your plan, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep him or her, and your insurance rates are going to go down. What happened? I am now on my third physician. I'm on my second plan for our business, and my insurance rates went up. Today, we were just told that my wife and I insurance is going to cost roughly $1,700 a month. This isn't working for us. In the plan that we need to allow people to have choice. I care about New Mexicans. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, your reply.
What we need when it comes to health care is a free market approach to health care, and we're about as far removed from free market as we possibly could be. Look, I reject the insurance model completely. If we had a free market approach to health care, we would have insurance to cover ourselves for catastrophic injury and illness, and we would pay as you go in a system that would become incredibly affordable. We could have health savings accounts that the government provided to pay for the cash that we would pay out for ongoing medical need. Look, if there was a free market approach to health care, there would be Gallbladders Are Us. There would be clinics that would offer gallbladder surgery at thousands of dollars as opposed to tens of thousands of dollars. And you can extrapolate that when it comes to Stitches Are Us, X-rays Are Us, I'll read your X-rays by Radiologists Are Us. This is what we could be doing. And look, the problem with the Affordable Health Care Act, it's anything but affordable, and it doesn't cover anything. Pre-existing condition. Look, we could have addressed that. We can address that. But let's get a free market, a definite free market here, lowering costs unbelievably.
Our first rebuttal opportunity is from Mr. Heinrich.
Pre-existing conditions, we did address that. We did that in the Affordable Care Act. And for the first time in our nation's history, you couldn't, as an insurance company, deny someone coverage because they have diabetes or a heart condition or because they're pregnant. So we not only did that we expanded Medicaid, and as a result, we brought down the number of people who were uninsured in New Mexico dramatically. People started getting health care from a doctor instead of in the emergency room. Both of my opponents...
Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Rich, 30 seconds as well.
Thank you. Pre-existing conditions are a big deal. It's huge. My family experienced that very thing when our youngest daughter, my wife, was pregnant with Margaret, and it became a complicated pregnancy and we lost coverage. So we were able to get coverage through the insurance pool, the state insurance pool. So that's important. Pre-existing conditions, we need to ensure that those are covered. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, 30 seconds.
When I was governor, we switched from a fee-for-service model to a managed care model. We saved about 25% when it came to Medicaid, and the proof's in the pudding. It still exists today because it worked. But what we need is an innovative approach. What we need is somebody that's not a wallflower in Washington that's willing to take on these issues. And right now, everybody's got their heads in the sand over these issues.
Our next question in our debate comes from Action 7 News anchor Shelley Rabando. Shelley?
What role do you believe the federal government should have in the education of our children?
Mr. Rich, you go first.
I believe that we need to get the federal government out of the classroom and let teachers teach. Right now, federal bureaucrats in Washington, the Department of Education, are getting at twice what our teachers are being paid, and they're not paid teaching a single student. There's something wrong there. So what we need to do is put the control back to our teachers, back to the communities in our state. Allow them to teach the students what needs to be done. We need to do it at a local level. Having Washington control what's going on in our classroom isn't right. And this continues to go on, and this needs to come to an end. I care about our state. I built the schools around our state. So I am committed to the education for all New Mexicans.
Mr. Johnson, you're next.
What the federal government needs to do is abolish the Federal Department of Education. Somehow we think the Federal Department of Education was established under George Washington. It was established under Jimmy Carter. And when I was governor, I did an analysis on federal funds to New Mexico. Guess what? We give Washington 12 cents. It goes through a wash and dry cycle. They give us back 10 cents when it comes to education. 12 cents to the Department of Education, we get back 10. But it comes with 15 cents worth of strings attached. You got to do A, B, C, and D to get your 10 cents, but it costs 15 cents. So if the Federal Department of Education never existed, there would be more money in the classroom in New Mexico. Get the federal government out of education.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Heinrich, you are next, 1:15.
Well, I wouldn't start by abolishing the Department of Education, in part because it's been absolutely critical to making sure that people with disabilities and other groups that had been discriminated against historically could actually get a public education, and that's really important. I actually worked with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to craft a complete reform of what we used to call No Child Left Behind. That was what put bureaucrats in charge and testing to the point of not being able to teach in the classroom. We reformed that to put teachers back in the driver's seat. The reason why that's not the case in New Mexico is because our governor hasn't taken that legislation up and actually implemented new rules. But we also need to do more. We need early childhood investment in our state. States across the country are doing that, and we're falling behind. That's why our workforce is falling behind. And we need to lower college debt. We should do what we did for the GI Bill, where we updated it to make it work like it used to. We should do that for the Pell Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Heinrich. 30-second rebuttal opportunity, Mr. Rich.
I don't know what to say. What I'm hearing from Senator Heinrich is the fact that we need more control in Washington. This isn't, central planning has never worked. We need the control back in our communities and at our state level. I care about our state. Our state knows best, our communities knows best what's good for our children, not Washington, not the bureaucrats in Washington. Martin Heinrich has abandoned the people in New Mexico once again with education.
Mr. Johnson, 30 seconds.
When I was governor, I was more outspoken than any governor in the country regarding school choice. For 6 straight years, I proposed a full-blown voucher system in New Mexico. Bring competition to public education. Get Washington out of our public education. And when it comes to disabilities, look, there's a unit value for those that are on disabilities. There's a unit value for every student that goes to school. Distribute that unit value. Let the free market loose on education. Let tens of thousands of educational entrepreneurs loose in New Mexico and watch what happens. Watch the results. Staggering.
30-second rebuttal, Mr. Heinrich.
Let me remind folks what Governor Johnson did when he was governor. He vetoed teacher pay. He vetoed investments in early childhood education. He vetoed money for equipment in the classrooms. He's very proud of his vetoes. But if you look back in time, this is how our state got off track. It's by not making the investments we need to make. In Washington, I worked with Republicans like Lamar Alexander, Democrats like Patty Murray, to pass legislation that actually put teachers back in the driver's seat.
My pledge was to put more money into education every year I was governor, and I did that every single year.
You'll have an opportunity to address each other later on in our debate, so we'd like to please hold those comments for now. We're going to continue with our questions right now, coming from Albuquerque Journal Senior Editor Kent Waltz. Kent.
Thank you. What can we do to improve school safety? And specifically, do you support arming teachers who volunteer and undergo training?
Mr. Johnson, you go first.
Well, school safety. After Columbine, I was asked as governor what could be done to prevent a further Columbine. I said, you're not going to like the idea, or you may not disagree with what I'm about to say, and I'm not proposing the following, but if teachers were allowed to be armed, for those teachers that wanted to be armed, if they underwent training, I think it would serve as a deterrent. Certainly it's not the answer, but certainly Washington is not the answer. And back to schools. Look, money in the classroom. I pledged to put more money in the classroom every year I was governor, and every year as a percentage of the budget, education increased. It gave me the license to criticize education, public education in New Mexico, because the results did not follow the money. And hence I took up the position of school choice in a really big way. Bring competition to public education. Watch, the results will be amazing.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Heinrich, you are next.
I'll just start and say that competition is code for privatizing education. I don't support that. But going back to the issue of school safety, you know, I'm a gun owner, and some of my best memories with my own sons have been legally and appropriately using firearms. But we have an epidemic of firearm violence in this country, and we need to actually do something about it. You know, my mother-in-law is a teacher, and we ask a lot of teachers. She's retired now, but I can't imagine asking her to carry a firearm in her class. I don't think that's a rational way to solve these issues. We need legislative approaches like the red flag law that allows someone who's deeply troubled to have their firearms temporarily taken away. There are things that we can do that protect legal, appropriate firearms owners, but make sure that firearms don't fall into the hands of the violent or the mentally ill.
Mr. Rich, your response?
My heart goes out to those families that have wished their son or daughter goodbye in the morning as they go away to school, and then get a call in the afternoon and saying they're not coming home. I can't imagine what that's like. I care about the people in New Mexico, but also I care about, and it's important to me, the Second Amendment. No one should lose their Second Amendment right without due process. My daughter was last year in college. I got a call from her saying that there was a stalker. I had to go up to Colorado and file an injunction against this individual, a restraining order. Stop in at the school. We talked about it. That individual had no business having a weapon. I don't think he didn't know. But what we're talking about is ensuring that our schools are protected, whether that's including a perimeter fence and where visitors are coming through screening process, or whether we have armed individuals on campus. But we see that doesn't always necessarily work as well. It's a tough choice. It's challenging. But man, bothers me to think that we need to harden our schools. We don't need to harden our hearts. I care about our state. I care about our students.
Mr. Johnson, you have the first rebuttal.
We should be open to a debate and a discussion on how we keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. I just haven't heard a suggestion that would actually accomplish that. But that is a dialogue that we need to have. And hey, this is a debate. Send in your cards and letters. Get on the internet. Float some ideas out there. That's what this should be about.
Mr. Heinrich, you're next with your rebuttal.
I've heard some ideas. I sat down with the chief of police in Aztec who had to respond to that shooting, who said you should look at red flag laws. I sat down with the students from Aztec High School who said, how come you guys can't do anything? How come just because we can't do everything, you can't limit magazine size or get rid of these bump stocks or do something to show that you're willing to take on this issue? I am willing to take on this issue, and as a firearm owner, I think I have a special responsibility.
Mr. Rich, 30 seconds for you as well.
Yeah, we've worked in in Aztec as well as on the high school in Aztec, as well as in Roswell. It breaks my heart to see what's happened. It's not an easy solution, and it's not just a matter of technology. It's a matter of figuring out due process. How do we decide who is allowed to have a weapon? And then for what to do when those individuals do. It's not a simple answer. But I am committed to find that answer as your next U.S. Senator.
Time, Mr. Rich. Okay, now we're going to give each candidate a chance to ask their own question to one of their opponents. You'll have 30 seconds to ask it, 1 minute and 15 seconds to respond, and you'll get a 30-second rebuttal opportunity. Mr. Heinrich, you get to ask the first question.
Governor Johnson, I would simply ask, when you were running for president, you said that we needed to close 20% of our military bases and that we should sustain cuts to programs like Medicare and Medicaid at a level of 43%. I think those things would be devastating to the state of New Mexico. Do you still support those positions?
Unique to New Mexico, making the case to balance the federal budget, unique to New Mexico is the fact that all military assets in the United States belong in New Mexico. Things don't rust. We've got the ground space to conduct ground maneuvers. We've got the most restricted airspace of the lower 48 states. We've got the only supersonic corridor. When I was governor, I oversaw the BRAC Commission, which was slated to cut New Mexico bases. I should have headed up BRAC as governor of New Mexico, and we came out of that process actually gaining military assets. It's an argument unique to New Mexico, but my pledge to balance the federal budget, look, I think we'll end up gaining military assets because it's a legitimate argument. I would also make that same argument when it comes to the labs. Look, the infrastructure's here. We're spending money for infrastructure in other parts of this country, building new infrastructure. Why build it there when we could build it here? When you tighten the belt, when you balance the federal budget, you look to spend money most efficiently. In those two areas, money most efficiently spent is in New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Rebuttal, Mr. Heinrich, 30 seconds.
Well, I just don't think it's credible to say we're going to cut everywhere else, but not in New Mexico. Maybe if there weren't 48 senators from states other than New Mexico, you could do that. I think that's a pretty flippant answer.
It did happen
and
with,
it's not a serious approach.
With BRAC.
So I think we need a more serious approach that actually addresses these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Rich, you have your opportunity now to ask your question of one of the opponents.
Senator Heinrich, I'm sure you would agree with me that it's important that we represent New Mexico and Washington. As New Mexico's U.S. Senator, how many bills have you authorized and sponsored, and I mean sponsored, that have passed into law since you've been a senator in Washington?
Off the top of my head, we passed legislation that was signed by President Trump regarding FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, just in the last few weeks. I've passed legislation through the Senate, but more important, it's not about whose name comes first on a bill. What I've learned in Washington is if you're not trying to grab the credit all the time, You can do amazing things for the state of New Mexico. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act happens every single year. I'm a part of that. This year it had John McCain's name on it, which is only right. But that's how I've been able to grow thousands of jobs at our national labs, at Sandia National Lab, at Los Alamos National Lab. We've grown about 3,500 jobs over the course of my first term in the United States Senate. It shouldn't just be about credit. It should be about getting good things done. That's how I've brought new missions to New Mexico, like 4 squadrons of F-16s at Holloman Air Force Base, or the Missile Defense Battalion at White Sands. We can do better.
Mr. Rich, rebuttal, 30 seconds.
We didn't hear him say it was 0. Senator Heinrich has sponsored and 0 bills that have been written into law.
That's not true.
Not only that, as U.S. Senator, but not only that, he stood by while other states took our F-22s from Holloman Air Force Base. Our F-16s were stripped from our Air National Guard, and here it is in Los Alamos Labs. It looks like Savannah River is trying to get the leadership role for nuclear deterrence for our country. All while Mr. Heinrich has been standing on the sidelines.
Mr. Johnson, you asked the next question of one of your opponents, please.
Martin Heinrich. When I ran for re-election as governor, I controlled the debate process. I debated my opponent 28 times. Marty and I debated 28 times. Martin Heinrich, F-16s. Holloman is slated to become the largest F-16 base in the world, 115 F-16s. You had a widely publicized letter that opposed the expansion of the airspace that Holloman needs to accommodate those F-16s. Have I got it wrong? And it's great to see you, by the way, because we haven't seen each other this whole time. It would be wonderful to
Mr.
debate
Heinrich, respond.
going onward. So help me out with this.
Usually, Gary, when I see you, it's on a ski lift, and that's
You've
where
seen
you've
me
been
one
for
time.
the last few years.
You've seen me one time for 2 minutes, and I appreciated that. You were really nice.
Let's
You were
talk
really
about
nice,
fighter
really
aircraft. I helped bed down 4 squadrons of fighter aircraft at Holloman. 2 of those are permanent, 2 of those were working to make permanent. That's 4 times as many as were there when there were F-22s. And by the way, I wasn't in the Senate when those F-22s disappeared. I've worked consistently to find new airspace, and we're going to be able to do that because the German tornadoes that have been using the airspace in southern New Mexico have moved back to Europe, and we'll be able to put all of those F-16s to use here in New Mexico with some of the best airspace in the world. We don't have to compromise and give up our greatest natural resources that drive a $10 billion economy worth 100,000 jobs to protect our national security. We can do both, and I've done both.
Mr. Johnson, rebuttal, 30 seconds.
Well, I got to call BS on the $10 billion and 100,000 jobs. But back to the F-16. You wrote a letter saying that you opposed the expansion of the airspace because it would negatively impact the Gila wilderness experience. I wrote a letter similarly. Look, we should be with open arms. We should greet the Air Force and say, look, we want this expansion, and yes, there are issues regarding the expansion of the airspace, but we'll deal with them. Did you not write that
Mr. Johnson.
editorial?
Time's up. Okay, our next question comes from Action 7 News anchor Shelley Rabando. Shelley?
Do you think our border with Mexico is secure enough in terms of both illegal immigration and drug trafficking? And if not, what would you suggest to make it more secure?
Mr. Heinrich, you go first.
Well, our border can always be more secure, and we should work to make it more secure. And when I've met with ranchers, when I've met with local residents, when I've met with elected officials all along that border, they think the idea of a 3rd century wall in a 21st century era is just ridiculous. We should be investing in technology. We should be supporting the people who patrol down there. We should also be investing in our ports of entry. Most of the drugs that come into the United States, most of the contraband, doesn't come in across some remote stretch of the border. It comes in through our ports of entry. And most of my colleagues don't know the difference between a Customs and Border Protection officer and a Border Patrol agent. I do, and that's why I've been making smart investments in our border. We also need to address immigration. And I am disgusted by how this president has used immigration as a dog whistle racial issue to divide America. We shouldn't be separating families. We should be promoting dreamers and welcoming them with open arms.
Mr. Rich, you're next.
I've been down to the border. I've met with the ranchers down there. I remember I pulled in there and 25 miles from the border. We talked for about 2.5 hours. We talked about they have a Chihuahua. Why? Because when the drug runners come through their rangeland, they're right through their property, the middle of the night, rattling the doors and windows so they know. I was down there listening to them, and I thought, man, I got to do something. It's not right. A month later, there it was in Albuquerque. The Albuquerque Journal was a photograph with Senator Heinrich with the very two ranchers that I met with. When I went down there, I said, this isn't right, and I'll do something about it. The emails that I saw, great photograph of Senator Heinrich, and the emails that I got from the ranchers was, his response was, what, not much I can do here, and headed home. Where he lives in Silver Springs, Maryland, they don't have a problem on the border. That's why it's not a concern. He has abandoned the people in New Mexico. I care about New Mexico, and I'm going to do something about the border.
Thank you, Mr. Rich. Mr. Johnson, minute 15.
Look, we need to make it as easy as possible for somebody that wants to come into this country and work to be able to get a work visa. And a work visa should entail a background check and a Social Security card so that applicable taxes get paid. But let's not build a wall across the border. We build a wall across the border, at some point we're going to tear down that wall for what it represents. Look, we're a country of immigrants. And when it comes to immigrants from Mexico, they are hardworking and they add to our economy. They come in, they buy things, they pay taxes. It's a good thing. Border security. Look, I'm not suggesting in any way that we decrease border security. We don't want drugs coming across the border. We don't want truckloads of convicts coming across the border. But that's really not happening, and that is due to the fact that we do have border security, hardworking individuals doing their job. They're doing a good job. Let's not build a wall, but let's fix our immigration system. It's broken.
Mr. Heinrich, rebuttal, 30 seconds.
Well, I've been going down to that same stretch of border since the 1990s. I camp down there, I visit friends, I spend time down there, I hunt down there. We can do a whole lot better, and I have yet to meet someone working and living down there who thinks the answer is a border wall. It's not a border wall. We can make smart investments in our border security, and we can have a reasonable, rational immigration policy. I mean, I had a guest at the State of the Union, Yvonne Orozco.
Time's up, Mr. Heinrich. I apologize. Mr. Rich, 30 seconds as well.
I don't know where to begin. Senator Heinrich was a congressman in Washington when the Democrats had full control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. Senator Heinrich and the Democrats committed to make a difference in immigration and in immigration policy. What we have and they did nothing. What we have right now is open borders and sanctuary cities. That is not an immigration policy. That is career politicians shirking their responsibility. Martin Heinrich has abandoned New Mexico.
Time, Mr. Rich. Mr. Johnson, 30 seconds as well.
I ran for president twice, and when I got off, or when I went to New Hampshire, the first thing that I got was I was just bombarded by New Hampshire citizens telling me that the scourge of the earth was Mexican immigration and that we needed to build a wall across the border. I went to Iowa and found the same thing to be true. It was my voice that said, no, I'm a border governor. This is not true. Everything that you're saying is not true. And when we build the wall across the Mexican border, then we should build a wall across the New Hampshire Canadian border.
Johnson.
Oh, that's about the stupidest thing we've ever heard. Well, the wall across the border is about the stupidest thing
Our
I've
next
ever
question comes from Albuquerque Journal senior editor Kent Walton. A reminder to our candidates, please, you're having an easier time with the minute 15 for the answer and the tough time with the 30 seconds for the rebuttal, so please keep to the 30 seconds. I'm sorry, Kent, go ahead.
Thank you. Let's stay on the topic of immigration. If you could write your own immigration reform policy, what would it look like?
Mr. Rich, you go first.
It's very simple. Number one is, if you're not a citizen of the United States, whether you're legal or illegal, you're not a responsible member of the community, you break our laws, you can't stay here. Two, if you've come here illegally, and we need to establish that date, if you come here illegally, you get a card to stay. But if you want a path to citizenship, then you need to exit our country and go back home and then re-enter legally. For those DACA, My heart goes out to them. You came here with your parents. We need to have a path forward for you. And what that means is that you get in line with everyone else that's legally applying for citizenship. I've talked with immigrants that have worked through the system. They've done it. They talk about how difficult it is and how rewarding it is. Good things take time. That's what I'm committed. I care about our state. I care about the people come into our country. But what we need to do is ensure that we secure the border so immigrants come through our border crossings, not through our open borders. I went to a border task force meeting. Mexican cattle are getting across our property, our borders. If Mexican cattle can, immigrants can, everybody can. We need to do something.
Mr. Rich. Mr. Johnson, you're next.
Well, what we need to recognize is the main category of illegal immigrant is somebody that came here legally on either a travel visa or a work visa. It expired. It was a different time, different day. They stayed. Different time, different day. They raised families. They became taxpayers. And now we're going to deport these hardworking individuals. We're separating families at the border. If I could write my own piece of legislation, let's make the line moving to get a work visa. And if you can make the line move to get a work visa, those citizens from Mexico that want to come into this country and work will stand in that moving line.
Mr. Heinrich, you're next.
Well, in the Senate, I helped to pass immigration reform. We did it in a bipartisan way. We dealt with the dreamers. We dealt with folks who are already here, who've overstayed a visa and whose only crime is their immigration status. And they should be able to get in that line and become American citizens by earning that right. You know, I'm tired of the narrative that Governor Johnson brought up, that the border is this terrible, lawless place. When you spend time in Lordsburg and Deming and Mesilla, you know that that's not true. I'm not, no. Right. And I believe that not only can we do this better, but we'll be so much better for it. Yvonne Orozco Acosta that I mentioned, she was my guest at the State of the Union address, but more importantly, not only is she a dreamer, she is New Mexico's Teacher of the Year. That's exactly the kind of folks who should be earning their American citizenship in this country. And I met a father at the border. If he'd have showed up just a few days earlier, his 3-year-old would have been ripped out of his arms. He was a refugee, not an illegal immigrant, not a criminal. I just think that this president has so polarized this country that we should come together and pass comprehensive immigration reform.
30-second rebuttal.
I went to the border task force meeting a year and a half ago. I listened to the border agents talk about what's going on. I listened to a rancher stand up and say, I don't think I should be maintaining 6 miles of border fence to keep Mexican cattle off my land. People said they've been talking about it for 13 years. The folks from Washington said, let's have a committee. The time for committees is over. The time for acting is here. I agree. We need comprehensive immigration reform, but we need to secure the border.
Time, Mr. Rich.
We need to make sure people enter the border through border crossings.
Mr. Johnson, a half a minute for you as well.
When I was governor, there were a lot of situations where the federal government came in and detected someone who was here illegally, who had a family. And without exception, unless the exception was that they had been convicted of a violent crime or DWI, that I would grant a stay, that they did not have to be deported. Look, the direction that this president is pointing toward when it comes to immigration is 180 degrees wrong.
Mr. Heinrich, your rebuttal, 30 seconds.
We're talking about real people here. Real people whose families are being torn apart. Real people whose only crimes have been their immigration status. It should not be the job of immigration enforcement to chase grandmas through the streets in Mesilla. It shouldn't be the job of immigration enforcement to hang out outside of churches or outside of courts. We can make this better by making it a public safety-focused immigration enforcement approach. And we can pass bipartisan immigration reform with the DREAM Act.
Okay, our next question, because of time, there will not be a rebuttal opportunity for this particular question. And this question comes from Action 7 News anchor Shelley Ribando. Shelley.
As you know, military bases in New Mexico are critical to our economy and our infrastructure. Would you support the creation of the so-called Space Force? And how would you ensure that the new military branch is partially based here?
Mr. Johnson, you go first.
We do have assets to accommodate the Space Force, but look, this is an expansion of government. We're going to create another branch of the military when I think this branch perfectly fits within the Air Force. We continue to spend more and more money. We continue to blow up the deficit. Look, if and I do believe this is going to cost a whole lot more money to create a new division of the military as opposed to folding it into the Air Force. But if borrowing money were the key to success, then Zimbabwe would be the center of the world, followed by Venezuela. It doesn't work. There's a day of reckoning coming if we don't address the deficit in this country. And that day of reckoning will be horrible inflation, where the money you have in your pocket will be literally worth less tomorrow than it is today. What are you going to do in that circumstance? You're going to go out and you're going to buy everything you possibly can. The shelves will be bare. That's what's in the future unless this issue gets addressed. And everybody in Washington seems to have their heads in the sand over this.
Mr. Heinrich, a minute 15 as well.
Well, I've got a little bit of experience with this because we have an amazing satellite mission at Kirtland Air Force Base that I have worked with for years. It was originally called ORS. It's now the Small Satellites mission there. And we were able to save that program and grow it because they take a more responsive approach that actually saves money. They're getting away from the gold-plated satellites that cost tens of billions of dollars, and they're putting satellites into space quickly and responsively. I think the devil's in the details when it comes to a Space Force. What would happen to that mission? What would happen to other missions at Kirtland Air Force Base and around our state? We need to understand that before we start talking about a new Space Force. Right now, the Air Force is doing that very well. If we keep those things here, if it's well designed, if we can gain efficiencies and save money, then I'm going to be open to it. But if it's just an excuse to create a new agency, then no, I won't be supportive.
Mr. Rich, your reply.
I don't know what to say. I can't believe we're actually talking about a Space Force. It does kind of put a smile on my face. I love Star Wars. But right now, Kirtland Air Force Base is home to the Space Technology Center and other departments associated with it. So it's just really an expansion of that. But what we need to talk about here today is about the current missions with our Air National Guard. Our Air National Guard has no airplanes, F-6, no F-6. We are the only state in the union with an Air National Guard with no airplanes. We need a senator to understand that we need to have a mission for them or we're going to lose our Air National Guard. That's logistics. Number two is I applaud that we've got F-16s now, and but we need a mission for Holloman Air Force Base that is going to last for the next generation, not just for 20 years. We're losing missions. Other states are picking off our missions. Senator Heinrich has stood by. He has been AWOL when the other senators are robbing our missions from our critical labs and bases. We need a senator that's going to stand up for New Mexico, and that is me.
Time, Mr. Rich. Okay, now is the time for the candidates to ask another question of one of their opponents, directed toward, again, one of their opponents. Mr. Rich, you would go first.
Governor Johnson, you talk about open borders, you talk about, and I've heard you talk about
open borders,
and I've heard you talk about sanctuary cities.
Sanctuary cities. I've never said a word about sanctuary cities.
And so I'm hearing, and we've got a problem here that needs to be addressed. We got to handle it. So the question I have for you is, I hear Senator Heinrich is for open borders. You're for open borders. Why? How do you differ from Senator Heinrich on open borders?
Mr. Rich. Your reply, Mr. Johnson.
Open borders. Look, make it as easy as possible to get a work visa. And a work visa should entail a background check and a social security card so that applicable taxes get paid. I'm not talking about reducing border security. I'm saying don't build a wall across the border. If that's your definition of open borders, I'm guilty.
Mr. Rich, rebuttal?
Gary, drugs are killing our state. Heroin, fentanyl are coming across the border. It's driving the crime into Mexico, and it's killing our citizens. I care about New Mexico. We need to secure the border. Our citizens need it. I've gone to at least one too many funerals for an young person that died of heroin. We need to get the heroin epidemic under control, and that's securing the border.
Mr. Johnson, you asked the next question.
Martin Heinrich, Social Security. Now, I haven't seen you. You haven't been in any debates, and, you know, that's okay. So I don't know what your response to this is. So I see you on television. I see your ads, which says, let's protect, or let's make sure Social Security stays the way it is. How does Social Security stay the way it is when it's going to be bankrupt in 2034? I mean, doesn't there have to be reform to Social Security? And I talk about reform all the time, whether that's a combination of raising the retirement age or...
So both of my opponents support raising the retirement age in Social Security. That's something that I don't support. But I do find it terribly ironic that a hedge fund manager who makes $1 million a year pays a lower Social Security rate than somebody who's a teacher in our public schools, or who's a small business person, or who's a plumber, or who's a firefighter. We can raise the cap. If we raise the cap on Social Security, we will save Social Security. But we shouldn't save Social Security on the backs of working people, on the backs of the retirees who need it most. So I am not for raising the retirement rate to 70 or 71 or 75 or anything else. I will vote to protect Social Security.
Mr. Johnson, rebuttal?
Well, look, there needs to be those things that you talked about, or a combination thereof. But when Social Security was implemented, the average age of an American worker was 55 years old. So nobody was going to even live to collect Social Security. Look, it's terribly unfair to young people that we're not going to say we're not going to touch the retirement age. For those already receiving Social Security, sure. And there's going to be this middle ground of those people that are going to get screwed